With the release of Stockfish 13 in the last week, I thought it might be interesting to go back and look at a game that was played almost 20 years ago. And if you're familiar with the Agadmator chess channel, as I'm sure most of you are, I'm a big fan of it. About 2.5 years ago, he analyzed a game on his channel that was played 16 years prior, and it's Kramnik against Peter Leko. And the interesting thing at the time was that he was using a Gadmentor, that is, using Stockfish 9 to analyze. And with a number of the engines that were the current state at the time, the engines weren't able to find a very, very interesting move that occurs later in this game. So now that Stockfish 13 is out, let's take a look and see if we can see if the engine does a better job and is able to identify this move. So it's later in the game, so I'll point it out when we get there. So it's Kramnik with the white pieces, opens with e4, e5. There's nf3, nsc6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop to a4, and f6, attacking the pawn on e4. Castles by white. Quite conservatively, bishop to e7 by Leko, and then Kramnik goes e1 to support his pawn on e4. We get b5 from Leko, the bishop drops back, and then just simply castling by black. So at this point, Kramnik wants to go after the center, so he prepares d4 by getting in c3, and Leko very aggressively goes into the martial attack. So this is direct d5, totally going after the central influence. And what can happen in this is that the e5 pawn will potentially be exposed, but the idea is that there's enough energy and momentum in black's counterattack that overcomes that drawback. So Kramnik decides to capture on d5. There's knight takes d5, and now with both the rook and the knight on f3 attacking e5, Kramnik just simply captures on e5. So we look into the evaluation, we see that the engine is assessing this as about even. And what's interesting too is with this window here with showing the results of other engines that tend to go at quite a high depth level, we can see with Stockfish 13 if it's evaluating the positions that come up rather differently. So as an example, Fritz 17 at a pretty high depth level was saying that it's almost a pawn advantage for white. But if we look at Stockfish 13's analysis, it's not quite as optimistic. So it definitely feels that knight takes e5 for black is the right move, and it evaluates this at about 54%. So, or 56% now. So knight takes e5, and then Kramnik recaptures on e5. So at this point, c6 is played. Again, the engines unanimously agree that that's the top line move. And the interesting thing is this bishop that's on c8 needs to think about where to develop. The problem with this c6 move is that Leko will have trouble if he develops on bishop to b7, then he's already kind of blocked the path of it. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with that bishop that's on c8. Kramnik goes into the center with d4, again emphasizing the center. Bishop goes to d6, so gaining a tempo on the rook here and also exerting influence over the e5 and f4 squares. We have rook dropping back to e1. So although this white rook has excellent control over the e-file, it's wasted a couple tempos recapturing an e5 and then dropping back. We get queen h4 by black, and then just simply g3 defending. So bit of an attack coming in, potentially some weakness on the king side. We have both these black bishops pointing into the king, so there's obviously a very serious threat on h2. So Kramnik decides to play g3, just blocking off that attack. So queen, it goes interestingly into h3, and again the engines in general and Stockfish 13 specifically is less optimistic for white's chances than some of this evaluation by Deep Fritz, and sees the game as approximately even. So we get r to e4, and that's a potential to come across to h4 and potentially trap the queen, or at least get tempo, and also start potentially an attack on black's h7 square. We get g5 by black, which is quite interesting. So weakening the squares on his king side for just an all-out attack on white's king. We get queen f1, offering the trade of the queens. And Leko's queen drops back to h5. White's got a bit of a development issue. So these three pieces are still at home and they need to get into the game as quickly as possible. So even though White's had good control over the center and an open file, it really is a bit behind on development. And you can see from a tempo perspective, the development of the last minor piece, bishop could go to f5 quite easily for Peter Leko. So we get end of d2, so Kramnik realizing that he's a little bit behind, needs to get going on his development. And we do, in fact, get bishop to f5. So developing, anytime you can develop a minor piece with focus on the center, so there's central control here over e4 and d3, and get tempo, that's a dream. So that's a fantastic move by black there. We get f3. So he's offering to go down the exchange. And so the position is about to get a lot more dynamic. So Leko for the time being turns down this exchange. So does not take it because he's, I think, worrying about the weakness potentially coming into here. So we can see right away with this knight in the way of the bishop, e3 is a bit vulnerable. So then we get knight dropping back to f6, so it's two minor pieces now attacking the white rook on e4. We get r to e1, and we get ra to e8. So black's development is excellent. He's got solid control over the center. He's challenging white's e-file control with the rook, and all the pieces are developed. So then we have r takes e8. So Kramnik decides to trade. And you can see that his development issue here is sort of beginning to become a bit of a problem. So right here is a good place to look at the engine evaluation again. We see the last iteration of Stockfish evaluating this as 0. And we see the current version of Stockfish evaluating it as 0 as well. So rook captures on e8. Then we get e4. So Kramnik deciding to challenge the queen side. Pawn structure that Leko has kind of left sort of unattended. Although it's questionable whether that was the right approach, because he probably should have paid more emphasis to what was going on the king side and all these threats. So you can see here that it's interesting the engines evaluate this position as even, because optically, I think to us as humans, most of us would prefer the black side here because it just looks like quite an aggressive attack. So queen goes back to g6. And what this does is, again, looking at the weakness of d3, if the bishop were to come into here, obviously it would put pressure on the queen on f1. So we get a takes b. So Kramnik attempting to open the a file for his rook. So he seems to have given up on the idea of developing it into the center. Probably a mistake, but given the cramped position of his knight on d2 blocking his bishop, he's trying to get some counterplay. So bishop to d3, and that tempo that we saw there did in fact get on the board. So queen just gets out of the way on f2, and we have rd2. So this is now, and we should go back a couple steps. So black, the evaluation has swung dramatically. So this is quite interesting. So at this point on move 22, the engines, the previous iterations of Stockfish are showing the evaluation as even. On that pawn take, also even. But then as the bishop comes in, it still says even, but queen f2 appears to be a major blunder. So on queen f2, now the evaluation changes quite dramatically. So r to e2 is called by all the engines, but if you can see here, on the Fritz engines, it's about 2 pawns, which of course is significant. But what it looks like is that if you look at Stockfish 13's analysis, and by the way, this is not the so-called invisible move that is coming up. But you can see that Stockfish 13's analysis is much more severe for black. So it's saying that RD2 is absolutely best, but now if you look at it, Stockfish 13 is saying this is a huge lead for black. So showing about 5.5 pawns at this point, even though the evaluation of 13, but you can see the zeros appearing here. So this shows that black is completely commanding the game. So it was interesting there that the engines quite didn't see that coming up, and then Queen F2 appears to be a lot bigger blunder than I think some of the engines originally thought. So now Kramnik realizes that he's in a lot of trouble, and so he decides to exchange the queen for the rook. So captures on queen on e2, and the bishop, of course, captures back. And now we have bishop takes a6. So what he's trying to do is he's saying, okay, black's got this speed and attack and just won a big material exchange on the king side. The counterplay is going to be that I push my pawn down the board and attempt to queen. So now this is the move that at the time the engines were not able to see. And it's queen to d3. And if we look at here, 2.5 years later with the later iterations of Stockfish, you can see at 12, it's saying that it evaluates this as much more winning for black than the previous engines. And again, with Stockfish 13, it's marking it as 0, which is absolutely blowout. Huge advantage for black. So queen to d3, that was the move that 2.5 years ago, Stockfish 9 and the other engines at the time had enormous trouble seeing the value of. So at this point, white's pretty much toast. So it's king to f2. And then bishop takes f3 comes in. And knight takes f3 here. So white's just trying to open the path for the bishop, but it's too late at this point, and we're seeing that it's well over 8 pawns at this point, the lead for black. So knight to e4 coming in with check. So black was very keen to remove the f3 pawn, which was controlling e4, because now his knight can get into the attack. So black running out of pieces, but we can see the development disadvantage that white has on the first rank. So king drops back to e1. And now knight takes on c3. So these moves are tricky to find. I mean, this pawn is protected, and black, of course, is only got 3 pieces left, even though one of them's the queen. But he decides to capture on c3, threatening, of course, mate on e2. So Kramnik is forced to recapture, but now we just have queen takes c3. And this pin, of course, hits the rook as well. And we're now, again, the zeros are all across the board. So Stockfish 13 is showing this as completely won for black. So king to f2. And then queen decides to capture the rook on a1. But what was interesting, too, is he had another option, which was actually g4. So Leko is sort of going for the material win here, which obviously makes a lot of sense, meaning he'd be left with 2 minor pieces for the queen. But g4 was actually playable here. So if this were to come on the board, then of course not mate, but the win of this knight is threatened. It would have to do something like go into g5, and then of course the capture on a1 was possible. So instead, Leko going for the material capture, so take on a1, and then Kramnik desperate to queen, but you can see here even the bishop, the white squared bishop, cannot get safely to d5 and protect that square. So game's pretty much over. And now h6 is played. This was a little inefficient, but black has multiple winning moves. h6 and then h4. White tries to prevent, but then g4, which really could have been played several moves ago and including on the last move. So With the queen on c3, g4 was more effective, because after that knight moves, there was also, with the queen on c3, there was also, because of the dark squared bishop, the queen capturing or potentially bishop capturing on g3 was a serious threat as well. So that's a game from 20 years ago, looked at with the scope of the latest iteration of Stockfish, and it does find that queen at d3 move quite comfortably. And it's interesting to see how engines have evolved. Only 2.5 years ago, the state of the art at that time, the engines were not able to find that move. So interesting progress.